Hello, my name is Olivia Mattis. I'm president of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. I'm so delighted that you have joined us here today. We have a nice large crowd and a very important program planned for you. This past week has been just a tremendous week for our foundation and for all those who honor the memory of Aristides de Sousa Mendes. This past Tuesday, October 19th, Sousa Mendes was inducted into the National Pantheon of Portugal in a speech given by the President of Portugal. So this was really a big moment and very thrilling to all of us who work on this subject and to honor this man. Also, Smithsonian Magazine came out, the November issue, that is dedicating most of its issue to our hero, the brave diplomat who saved thousands of lives in World War II. So if you have a newsstand near you, run out and get the November issue. It talks about Sousa Mendes, what he did, and also the work of our foundation. So this is very, very exciting. And in Portugal, I wasn't able to be there in person. I'm in the United States, but my colleague, Mariana Abrantes, whom you'll meet in a little bit, she was there. And she's going to moderate today's program. But first, let me tell you that today's program is in partnership with the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect USA. And I've been wanting to partner with them for a very long time. And I'm so thrilled to have their CEO with us today as my co-host. And that's Sharon Douglas. Sharon, how are you?
Very good, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be on this wonderful discussion. I am Sharon Douglas, the CEO of the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect in the United States. We are honored to be part of today's program, Miep Gies and the rescue of Anne Frank's diary with the Sousa Mendes Foundation. We at the Anne Frank Center, having been established in 1977 as a nonprofit organization, continues to educate and inspire people to learn about the dangers of prejudice and discrimination. We have touched thousands of students and teachers throughout the United States over the past 44 years. Our programs educate through the life and diary of Anne Frank and the lessons she can teach to all of us. Her legacy, passed down by her father, Otto Frank, continues to be relevant and critical today. The lessons from history are key to keeping all of us from making the mistakes of the past. The Anne Frank Center brings history to life using the arts, school programs, live performances, exhibits with peer-to-peer training throughout the United States to connect stories such as Anne Frank's tragic but inspiring life to the present. Our programs have been welcomed by tens of thousands of students and teachers in almost every state and at every level from elementary to college. The overall theme of our organization is brotherhood, tolerance, and universal humanity. As Anne wrote, human greatness does not lie in wealth and power, but in character and goodness. And now we will hear an audio clip of Miep Gies at the 1994 award ceremony of the Raoul Wallenberg Medal at the University of Michigan for her courage and daring in supporting the Anne Frank family in hiding. Of course, she was recognized for saving the Anne Frank diary, the very possession of which would have endangered her. The world has the diary because of Miep Gies' selfless acts. She did not see herself as a hero, only a good person. In this clip taken from her award ceremony, we hear Miep talk and tell us the importance of educating young people in the essence of humanity, sharing, and right and wrong. And we will now hear the clip.
In my opinion, education is the best way to improve our world. Children should learn from us that people often do not get in life what they deserve. We should tell them that, for instance, most victims of poverty and discrimination are innocent. That, therefore, we must help. We should also tell our children that they should always share with others, and that caring about their own business only did lead to the death of 6 million innocent Jews, among them Anne Frank. I feel very strongly that we should not wait for our political leaders to make this world a better place. No, we should make this happen now, in our homes and at our schools.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sharon, for bringing us this clip. And thank you to Miep Gies for bringing us this very powerful and inspiring statement. I'm Mariana Abrantes. I'm joining you from Lisbon, Portugal. I was very fortunate and very privileged to be at the Pantheon ceremony where Aristides Sousa Mendes received one of Portugal's highest honors, and with a number of members of the Sousa Mendes family, a large number, and with members of at least 4 families who were saved by Sousa Mendes. So it's been quite a week, and this evening is probably another high point. I have read the Diary of Anne Frank twice, and first in Portuguese in my village, and then in English in California. And I'm really looking forward to hearing it for the 3rd time and hearing the details of how it was saved and brought to us. So we're very fortunate today to have 2 people who have been very involved with the story and for many years. And I will introduce the 2 speakers who will tell us their experiences. And then I will come back at the end to collect and present your questions for the speakers. But first, let me tell you about our 2 speakers. We have Gillian Walnes Perry, who set up the Anne Frank Trust in the UK with friends and family of Otto Frank, including Miep Gies. And she has spoken at the UN, at 10 Downing Street, at the Houses of Parliament in the UK, and most recently at the Clinton Presidential Center. She knew Miep Gies well and has spent time with her, so she'll give us that personal testimony. And she's the author of a book called The Legacy of Anne Frank, published in 2018, which looks at the impact of the Diary of Anne Frank on education. For this and other work, she was honored by Her Majesty The Queen and inducted in the Order of the British Empire. Congratulations, Gillian. Then Gillian will pass on to the microphone to Meeg Pincus, who is the author of a children's book, Miep and the Most Famous Diary, The Woman Who Rescued Anne Frank's Diary, which was published in 2019. So it was very well received, highly recommended, and I'm waiting for my 3 copies. And so Meeg has also authored 24 other books on the people who she calls solutionaries. So I'm very anxious to hear what these people are. And she continues also educational activities in classrooms from universities to homeschooling. So I will now pass to Gillian, and I'll see you at the Q&A session. Gillian?
Thank you so much, Mariana. And I think Paola will put the first slide up now. There we go. Okay, so I look a bit different now. My hair's a different color, but that's actually me with Miep in Anne's bedroom. And I've been incredibly fortunate to have spent quite a bit of time with Miep in the 1990s and 2000s. And this photo was taken actually in Anne's room. You can see actually that famous chestnut tree behind us. Sadly, that chestnut tree was felled in a storm in 2009. And I know the Anne Frank Center have been planting saplings from it around the US. On that same visit to Amsterdam, and several times I did meet Miep in Amsterdam, I actually visited her apartment in the south of the city. And Miep was actually, until very old, she would wear incredibly high heels. Now, if any of you have visited the Anne Frank house, and I'm sure some of you have, you will know how steep those steps up to go to the secret annex. And even in her 80s and 90s, Miep had no problem bounding up those stairs in high heels. In her apartment in Amsterdam, I sat on her sofa, and I actually can't believe this actually happened, but she went to the drawers in her room, said, Gillian, I've got some things to show you. One of the things actually was the menu that Anne had typed out on the old typewriter in the secret annex, because Miep and her husband Jan were going to celebrate their first wedding anniversary by staying with the hiders in the secret hiding place overnight, which was quite an experience for them, which Miep describes later. And this was actually typed by Anne. She also brought out a shopping list written in pencil that Mrs. Frank had given her when she went to get supplies. And then she brought out a pair of high-heeled red shoes. And these are the very red shoes that Anne put on in the secret annex and wore and felt very grown up and described in her diary. So you can really imagine how exciting that visit to Miep's apartment was. And another memory I have is taking her to the BBC headquarters in London. And we walked around the corridors of the BBC. She was being interviewed for a radio program, and she's touched the walls, and she said to me, Gillian, she said, this was actually a lifeline to us in the war. I can't believe that I'm actually in the BBC. And in the taxi, she actually described Mrs. Frank from her personal recollections, and described that this was a poor woman who was only in her 40s, having a nervous breakdown in fear, and also showed me a ring that she was wearing that was given to her by Auguste Van Pels, Mrs. Van Down in the diary. And she said, you know, Auguste was such a sweet woman. Now, who was Miep? These slides show you Miep as a young girl. She was born in 1909 in Vienna, and her name was actually Hermine Sandruschitz. She was born into a Catholic family, and there you see her with her mother and her two sisters. I think that's Miep on the right-hand side with a big white bow and the white dress. They were not a well-off family. And after World War I, of course, Austria was on the losing side, and there was very little food. And so her parents sent her away to Amsterdam, to the Netherlands, the land of plenty, the land of milk and butter and cheese. It was a relief project for Austrian children that were malnourished. And so she arrived as an 11-year-old girl in Amsterdam in 1920. Next slide, please, Paola. She decided to stay in Amsterdam with her foster family because she became very close to them. And at 18, she started working as a typist in an embroidery workshop. She looks rather smart there, doesn't she, in her cloche hat? After the financial crisis, she was laid off, and a neighbor in her apartment building called Cynthia Blitz happened to mention that she worked for a very nice gentleman, a German refugee called Mr. Otto Frank. And she spoke to Mr. Frank and arranged an interview for Miep to perhaps go and work for Mr. Frank's Pector company, which manufactured pectin. Pectin is that natural setting agent for making jelly. I've spent time actually with Cynthia's great-granddaughter in London, and I've actually spoken in the great-granddaughter's school. Now, obviously, Miep did a good interview because she was hired by Mr. Frank. Paula, the next slide, please. And there she is sitting in the office of Mr. Frank's company at 263 Prinsengracht. And she was soon promoted to the Opecta Information Service, which required her to answer questions by phone and letter. No emails in those days. And she was actually taught the jelly making process, and she gave demonstrations on cinefilm. Next slide. She married Jan Gies in July 1941. And there they are on their wedding day. And if we see the next slide, look carefully and you'll see who attended the wedding. Because there's Mr. Frank, the tall man in the middle, and by his side is none other than his daughter Anne, walking along to attend the wedding of Miep and Jan. Now, by this time, Otto had actually had to hand over his business to his non-Jewish employees because of the German laws against the Jews. Now, Jan was not necessarily involved in the business day to day, Jan Gies, but he was on the board, and Mr. Frank trusted him implicitly. Otto's business was renamed Gies & Co. because of the Nazi laws. Now, Jan was actually involved in the Dutch resistance, and I had the great privilege of meeting him in 1991 when he came to London. And pretty soon afterwards, in 1993, he passed away. But my memories are of a very sweet and humble man. Now, I'm going to show you Miep in the office again, because this is Miep working in her office during those 2 years of the hiding. Now, as a helper, she was getting meat and vegetables for 8 people in hiding. By the way, she was also hiding a young Dutch boy in her own apartment that had refused to join the Nazi party, so his life was in danger. So she was really out of the frying pan into the fire. She was looking after 8 people in the hiding place, plus a boy in her own home. She had to carry that secret for 2 long years. Anne describes Miep in her diary by saying Miep is just like a pack mule. She fetches and carries so much. Almost every day she manages to get hold of some vegetables for us and brings everything in shopping bags on her bicycle. She actually spent hours cycling out to farms outside Amsterdam, and she also brought Anne and Margot library books. After the arrest of the family on the 4th of August, Miep made a desperate attempt to get them freed, and she actually went at huge risk to the Gestapo headquarters to try and buy the freedom of the 8 people that had been arrested. Sadly, she couldn't do it. There wasn't to be. That's another story for another time. Now, Miep wasn't the only helper. This photograph was taken of Otto after the war, when he came back into the business. So there's Miep on the bottom left. Bep Voskil was the secretary. She was still a teenager. She was about the same age as Margot when they were in hiding. And the 2 managers of the business, Johannes Kleiman and Victor Kugler. And these 4 people took enormous risks every single day for 2 years. And in the case of Johannes Kleiman, it took a great toll on the poor man's health. Next slide, please. After Otto returned from Auschwitz, he had nowhere to go. His apartment on the Moveda plain, before they went into hiding, had been requisitioned and given to a Nazi sympathizing Dutch family. So while his search for his 2 daughters, he knew his wife had died in Auschwitz on January the 6th, just 3 weeks before its liberation, but he thought his daughters may have survived. But he went to live with Miep and her husband Jan. You see Jan in the picture, there's Otto on the left, and there's their daughter, their son Paul, who was born in 1952, while Otto was still living there. In 1953, Otto remarried, and went to live in Switzerland. During his search for, he left no stone unturned during his search for his 2 daughters, but he did receive a telegram from the Red Cross not long after his return saying that the girls had perished. At that point, he came out of his office and he went to see Miep, and he said, Miep, the girls are no more. With that, Miep went to the drawer of her desk and she said, "Here you are, Mr. Frank. Here is the testament of your daughter." Unknown to Mr. Frank, she had been hiding and keeping safe Anne's diary in her desk drawer, at great risk to herself. After the arrest of the families, she and Bep had gone up the stairs to the secret annex, broken the lock to try and rescue anything that they could give back to the Frank family on their return. Remember, it was late in the war when they were arrested, and there was great hope that the 8 people would return. And she knew Anne had been writing a diary. She knew how precious it was to her. So she rescued the diary and kept it. So as we said earlier, as Sharon said earlier, thanks to Miep, we have Anne's diary. Now, next slide. The publication of the diary didn't occur till 2 years later, in 1947. There was quite difficulty of Mr. Frank finding a publisher. And also he had a moral dilemma whether to publish, because at the end of the day, it was Anne's private diary, and she had not written too kindly about the adults, and particularly her mother, who had been murdered so cruelly. But of course, he also knew that Anne's greatest wish was to have been a published writer, and she had been editing her diary from April 1944 with a view to it possibly being published after the war. So that's the first edition. It was called Het Achterhuis, the back house. And to date, Anne's diary has sold more than 30 million copies around the world in over 70 languages. Next slide, please. In 1995, Miep was in London to mark the 50th anniversary of Anne's death. And there she is speaking at a special ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral. That's me again, looking very young, with Miep. And also in that year, a 2-hour documentary called Anne Frank Remembered was shown on the BBC. And the following year, there was Miep and me walking down the red carpet in Hollywood to the Oscar ceremony, where Anne Frank Remembered had been nominated for an Oscar. And it was very, very exciting. And we drove past the Hollywood sign. And I said to Miep, we were in a limousine, and I went forward and I said, "Miep, what would Anne say if she saw us by the Hollywood sign?" Because Anne loved movie stars. She loved Hollywood and cinema. And Miep just sort of shook her head and sighed. And then, of course, the documentary won an Oscar. And John Blair, the director, goes up on the stage, not with a glamorous movie star in a designer dress as the audience are expecting, but a small white-haired lady. Who is this, the audience thought? John Blair stood on that stage and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, in a city of celluloid heroes, please meet a real one." And he explained that this was the helper of the Frank family. The whole audience erupted and stood on their feet. And I have to tell you, this is a night I will never, ever forget. Also in 1995, Miep was honored by Yad Vashem as Righteous Among the Nations. And she was also given a great honor by Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands. And my final slide shows Miep educating children, because really for the rest of her life after the war, she dedicated herself to the education of children, not only in the Netherlands, but also in Germany particularly, and the UK and around the US. Miep died age 100 in January 2010, 1 month before her 101st birthday. So, as I say, I've been extremely honored to spend time with this remarkable woman. And I'll say a few words more about her a little bit later on, but obviously now I would like to pass over to Meeg.
Oh, thank you, Gillian. I got chills so many times while you were speaking. I was just riveted by your personal recollections. So thank you. And I'm just so honored to be even a part of this event. I'm here to share the book that we have for children about Miep. And one of the things I always tell people when we talk about this book and picture books is that a lot of people don't know how many people it takes to make a picture book. So I wrote the manuscript for this book, but it was 2 years of work with this amazing illustrator, Jordi Solano, who's based in Barcelona, and an editor and an art director who studied Anne Frank's house and even where the light came in for the illustrations. We had expert readers, including on the back, Lisa Rappaport from the Anne Frank Center who read it for us, and someone from the Anne Frank house. So we had the historians involved. This is such a group effort, this book, as most picture books are, particularly nonfiction books, because we are dedicated to making sure that it's accurate and age appropriate when we're sharing stories with children, especially sensitive stories like this. So I thought I would start by reading you my author's note, which explains why I wrote this book and my connection to the story. And it was amazing to hear Gillian speak because she told so much of the story that's in the book. So I'll show you some illustrations after I read the author's note, illustrations of the story that you heard from Gillian. But my author's note reads, as a girl, I read the diary of Anne Frank over and over again, so much that I felt Anne was a friend. She had big feelings, Jewish heritage, and wanted to be a writer, just as I did. And I looked up to Miep Gies, Anne's protector, as a hero. And I want to show you, I have saved my childhood copy from the 70s of Anne Frank's diary. I always show kids. I saved this book through many moves all around the country and abroad. I saved this book, so I still have it. And then as a young woman, more than 20 years ago, more than 25 years ago now, I had the honor of meeting Miep in person. She was in the United States on a tour, and I was a newspaper reporter assigned to write a story about her talk at a local school. I've never forgotten her quiet, gentle strength or the love in her eyes when she spoke about Anne 50 years after World War II. So it was late 90s, so right after that picture that Gillian showed. And I based this book on Miep's own autobiography, and every quote you read in this story is exactly as Miep remembered in that book and her speeches and interviews. Now, sometimes she said things a little bit differently in these places, but we always used Miep's words as she expressed them in any of these places. So other people's accounts about some details differ, and some of the action is condensed, but this story is based on how Miep remembered these events in her life and shared them. And I am honored to share Miep's story with today's children. And I'll say also that when I was writing this book, I sort of had two ways I thought about telling the story. And one of the ways I have also in this back matter was about Miep's courage. Gillian touched on some of the many things she did of riding her bike into the countryside and hiding the young man in their apartment. So many things she did that were so courageous. So that was one option I had for writing the story. And I'm glad I got to put that part of Miep's life in the back matter. But in a picture book, you have 32 pages and so few words. And the story I chose to tell was the story of her saving the diary and then her relationship with the diary. So that's what this book is. And I'm going to just kind of walk you through the illustrations. I don't have time to read it all, but I'll show you, especially if you're considering this book for children in your life. I say the book is middle to late elementary school. And Paula, if we want to put up that first slide, that would be great. So there's the cover, and you can see the same picture that Gillian showed, which we got permission to use from the Anne Frank house, and that famous picture of Anne. So there's, so could we go to the next slide, please? And here's the first spread. And you'll see like I said, the illustrator and the art director looked at where the light came in on Miep's desk. I mean, the detail is incredible. I can't say enough about Jordi Solano's art here. My story uses a lot of sounds, and you might be able to see it says thump, thump, thump. And I start the book with those footsteps on the secret back stairs, which Miep herself called the worst sound she ever heard. So this was the day of the capture that the Gestapo officers came and took Anne's family and the other hiders and the two other co-workers. And one of the things also about a picture book is that they're meant to be read to children aloud. And one of the great publishers of children's books once said, and it stuck in my mind, that a children's book is like a piece of theater for children. The adult reading it is presenting them with a story that we want them to be present in, just as we do a piece of live theater. So I thought about that as I was writing, and I chose to make the book in present tense and use these sounds that I had unconsciously taken in reading Miep's words again and again in my research. She often talked about what she heard, and I hadn't even consciously realized that until I started writing. And then looking back, I had gotten that from her. So next slide, please. So then we move to the sound of this Gestapo officer who came in to confront Miep. And she has this moment where she realizes from his accent that they were both from Vienna. And she connects with him, just this moment of human connection that saved her life. And she writes about being torn about that because she wanted to go with them. She wanted to be with them, but she knew that if she stayed, she could try to save the business and save what she could. So when he allowed her to stay, she sat. And the next slide, please. And so here we have Miep's memory and some just sort of explanation for the children about what had happened before this moment. And we get to see Anne in her room, and we get to see that diary on the desk and hear about how she always was writing it, and about what Miep was doing to hide the people. So next slide, please. So here we have them being taken away. And you'll see that the art is all this very sepia toned. We wanted that sort of historical sepia toned look, but also slightly modern, so kids felt that it was relevant. I think he did a beautiful job. And next spread, please, or next slide. And then you hear the screech of the van tearing off down the street, and they're gone. And here in the writing is where Miep is sitting in silence, and they're all gone after 2 years of all of them being in this space together and holding on. And the war, as Gillian said, was almost over. And she was just sitting there devastated for hours. Next spread, please. Except all you could hear was the tick, tick, tick of the clock. And so here we have Miep going up the stairs into the secret annex. Her husband, Jan, who I use the name Henk and in the book because that's the name that Anne used in her diary. So we made the choice in the children's book to use the names Anne used, knowing that children would be graduating on to read Anne's diary. So we kept true to the names Anne used. So Henk arrives with his coworker Ellie, who is Bep, who you saw at the beginning. And they all go up the stairs to see what had happened. Thank you, Paula. Yeah, this is the next slide where Miep and Ellie are picking up the diary, and then also loose pages. There were many loose pages of Anne's writing. So Miep picked up the diary and these loose pages, and she also grabbed Anne's delicate combing shawl. And I say, strands of her dark hair clinging to its fabric like silky noodles, just imagining that there was still that piece of life there. So next slide, please. And now we hear ba-bum, 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 and that is Miep's heartbeat. And she talks about how terrified she was. As Gillian said, she knew that she could get, her life was in danger by taking that diary, by having it, and the people who were written about in it were in danger. But she knew she needed to save it for Anne, and she put it in her desk drawer and vowed to never look at it or read it, that she would just give it back to Anne when she returned. So next slide, please. And here we skip 9 months ahead, and whoosh, it was a windy day, Miep recalled, when Henk came home, Jan came home to tell her that the Nazis had surrendered and the war was ending. So now the question became, who of their friends survived? Did any of them survive? So next slide, please. And now Otto, Mr. Frank, comes to Miep's door. And in this spread, she learns that his wife had died, but he's still holding hope that Anne and her sister Margot survived. So next spread. And here, again, I had remembered subconsciously that Miep talked about that sound of ripping, that shh of the envelope or the telegram of that letter that contained what she called the worst possible news, that Anne and her sister had not survived the war. They had died of illness just 2 months before in the camp of starvation and illness. They almost made it, but they didn't. And she's just stunned and shocked. So next slide, please. So she reaches into the drawer and gives Mr. Frank the diary and the pages and the combing shawl. And this was a choice I had to make because she had talked about this moment several times. And in one, she said, this is the legacy Anne has left for you. And in one, she said, this is what Anne has left. So again, I had to make these choices as an author of which of Miep's words to use. So I chose the simpler words since it's a book for children. And she hands it to him and says, this is what Anne has left. And he takes it into his office, and you can just see the emotion. The illustrations when I first saw them just made me weep. Next spread, please. And then this is the spread of Mr. Frank reading the diary, and he just savored every single word in it. He read it over weeks, and he said to Miep, she recalled, Miep, you must read Anne's writing. Who would have imagined what went on in her quick little mind? He was getting to know his daughter in a new way by reading this diary. And as Gillian said, he wasn't sure whether to publish it, but he was persuaded, and he knew Anne always wanted to be a famous writer. She wanted her words to be shared with the world. And then here where we learn that Miep would not read it. She refused every time Mr. Frank asked her again and again, and she couldn't bear to read it. The way I wrote it was, she pushed her tears down so deep inside, if they surface, she will surely drown in sorrow. So she kept refusing, even as the diary started to become popular and spread to different countries and different languages. And then finally, can we get to the next spread, please? Click. We hear the door of her room close as she finally decides, long after it has become a famous, precious book to many, she finally decided to read it. And I could not ever read this to children. This spread is the one where I always break. The idea of the visual of her reading and Anne being there with her in spirit. And I quote from the diary, Anne, her voice ringing clear from the page. She says, I want to go on living even after my death, and therefore I am grateful for this gift of writing, of expressing all that is in me. And almost 2 years to the day of living in hiding, she had written, in spite of everything, I believe people are good. I still believe people are good at heart, which I think is such the ringing message of Anne, that it resonates still to children, to all of us. So the final spread, thank you, Paula. This was a group decision we made as well, which I'm very glad we did, was we ended the book in modern times with modern children looking at this bookstore with all these different translations of Anne's diary. And Jordy you can see the cover of Miep, he snuck in there as well, but these books that carry on the legacy. And the last line of the story, as Miep is reading this diary, and she realizes she is holding one of the most famous books in the world. Anne Frank's diary is translated into many languages and treasured by millions of readers. It dawns on Miep, because of the little checkered diary that she saved on that worst ever day, August 4th, 1944, her beloved Anne will live on and on. And that's how we end the story And oh, thank you all. I see some lovely gestures. And again, there's the author's note, there's the Miep's story of Miep's courage, and there's a timeline in the back which goes from her birth in February 1909 to 2019 when the book came out, and of how her legacy of what she did still lives on today. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just so excited by your book and so delighted that we're offering it to our audience. So audience members, you have until Wednesday evening at 10 p.m. Eastern time to put in your order. And then you'll have this book as a gift for yourself or for a loved one, a child in your life. And we will have the books out to you by the beginning of November at the latest, maybe even the end of October. So, so put in your orders today. I really encourage it. After today's program, you will get an email about upcoming programs. Let me just briefly tell you what's coming up the next few weeks, and then I'm going to hand it back to Mariana for the Q&A. Next week, we're focusing on the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games, and in particular on the American runner, Jesse Owens. And we have his grandson with us in person, and he looks just like his grandfather. We also have a member of the International Olympic Committee who'll be there speaking on behalf of that organization. And we have a historian, Lori Weintraub, will be talking in general terms about the Olympic Games, and that program will be moderated by my colleague, Robert Jacobitz. So that's next week. It is a free program, just like today's program. In 2 weeks' time, we're focusing on Theodore Herzl, who was quite a prophet. He's known as the father of the state of Israel, but he died in 1904. Decades before Israel was a reality. And he prophesied, or he stated correctly, that the Jews of Europe at the beginning of the 20th century were sitting on a volcano that was about to erupt. And he thought it was urgent and essential that the Jews get out of danger and that there be a state where they can go. And he dedicated the last 8 years of his life to writing about it and trying to convince everyone that this was what had to happen. He wrote in his own diary that if he were to state out loud, well, he said in 1897 at the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, he said the state of Israel, or the Jewish state, was born in Basel, Switzerland. He writes in his diary. But he says, if I were to state this out loud, I would be considered a madman today. But in 5 years, and certainly in 50 years, everyone will see how obvious that is. So that is really quite an extraordinary prophecy. And we have a film about him called My Herzl, which was made about a Canadian collector of Herzl memorabilia named David Matlow, who will be with us, along with Herzl's biographer, Derek Penzlar. And we also have Professor Shulamit Reinhardt from Brandeis, and that should be quite a marvelous program. We are selling tickets for that program. We recommend $18 or high, but it's by free donation. So whatever donation level is comfortable for you, that's fine with us. And we just want you to be there. So that is in 2 weeks' time on November 7th. The following week, November 14th, we're coming back to our own story, the story of Sousa Mendes. We're showing a brand new film called The Legacy of Aristides. We'll have the filmmaker, we'll have Sousa Mendes's grandson, and we will have Cookie Fisher, whose mother was saved by Sousa Mendes. We'll be talking about her own family story. So those are the next 3 weeks. You'll have the information in the email that you received this afternoon. So now back to you, Mariana.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Olivia. Yes, I look forward to all of those very interesting programs. I have been looking through the questions. I must say there are more comments than questions because people are saying how moving and beautiful. How moving is the story, and how beautifully it is being told. So congratulations and thank you. I do have some questions that have come up. One was how the Franks were found and who denounced them, and was Miep Gies herself ever investigated for hire or punished for being for helping them? So who would like to answer that? Gillian?
Yes, I'll start. In terms of the betrayal, and there's actually a chapter in my book about who betrayed the Frank family, there have been several theories over the years. There is one theory that has recently come to light that I believe carries more weight than any others. But all I can say is that the one thing we do know is we will never know conclusively who betrayed the Frank family, because everybody that can confirm or deny is long dead. I know that there is a Dutch documentary maker who has been working with a retired FBI agent, Vincent Panconi, I believe his name is, and they have been using modern technology to try and ascertain who could have betrayed the Frank family. But even with that, it would be pure speculation. And so, as I say, there is one theory that I think carries much more weight than others. It's come out recently in a book, and I've known about this theory for a long time. But we will never know conclusively. In terms of Miep, it's an interesting story, and Meeg alluded to it in the book. It's mentioned in the book that the arresting Gestapo officer recognized her accent, or she recognized his accent. They were both originally from Vienna. And of course, he heavily berated her for committing the terrible crime, the treasonable crime of hiding Jews. But she sort of managed to convince him to let her go. Bep actually ran away. Mr. Victor Kugler and Johannes Kleiman were both arrested and had different fates. Kleiman, I mentioned earlier, he actually had suffered terribly with a stomach complaint from the sheer stress of looking after those people for 2 years. And he was actually hospitalized. He was imprisoned, but then hospitalized by the Red Cross. And then after the war, he slowly recovered. He didn't live much longer. Victor Kugler actually managed to escape from his imprisonment. He actually took the advantage of an Allied bombing raid when he was being transported to another prison, and actually escaped and lived out the final months, hiding first in a farmhouse and then actually managing to cycle back to his own home. So they had very different fates. Miep was just, I guess, very fortunate. She took an incredible risk by going to try and buy the freedom of the 8 people in hiding. She raised a little bit of money. But she found herself being sent upstairs to a more senior officer to try and do the deal. And just as she walked into that office, he was listening to the BBC. And that was a very punishable thing to do. And he was at risk, and she could have reported him, and he threw her out of the office. So that was really the end of the story. She just simply went back to work and lived out the rest of the war, the remaining 7 months, working in the office.
Thank you, Gillian. Other questions. There are the questions about the sounds. Weren't they required to be sitting still all day, and they could only move it now at night?
Yeah. Meeg, do you want to answer that one?
Yes, when you read or reread the diary, there's so much in there about how quiet they had to be, which may be why when there was a sound, Miep mentioned it, remembered it, right? Those footsteps were such a horrible sound to her, because that was the last thing they wanted. Silence. They didn't want anyone coming down during the day and making sound, because if that was happening, that meant something had gone terribly wrong.
Okay.
Remember things that we take for granted, like they couldn't flush the toilet during the day, because that could have, the sound could have resonated downstairs. They had to be very careful of coughing and sneezing. And it may be, who knows, that towards the last weeks and months of their hiding, and especially when they were following the Allied advance after D-Day and hopes were high that they were soon going to be liberated, perhaps they became a little bit complacent about the level of sound that they were making. Who knows?
Then, thank you. Then a question about Miep's families, whether she has family members who have continued involved with the Anne Frank house and with the story.
Miep had a son. You saw him as a baby in the photo, Paul. He was born about 1952-53, and he has children. So Miep had 3 grandchildren as well. In terms of their connection to the story, I've never heard, Sharon might correct me, I've never heard of him being actively involved, or the grandchildren.
Okay, thank you. Then there's a question about the diary itself, where it is today, who is it on display, and the original picture, the original book, red book.
Yes, I have to say that this is not the original. I couldn't afford the insurance. This was a facsimile made in Hong Kong when we took the Anne Frank exhibit to Hong Kong several years ago. It's actually on display in a very thick glass case at the Anne Frank house. It's actually owned by the Dutch government, and it's on permanent loan to the Anne Frank house. So if you visit the Anne Frank house, you will actually see the original. It had been removed for several months because they were doing work on it. Some actual work on the diary. So it was very unfortunate for those people that actually visited the house in those months, but I believe it is back on display now.
And then a question for Meeg about her personal challenge in writing the book, how she chose the topic and the approach.
Well, how I chose the topic, it's funny, I was saying this to the panelists before we came on, that I thought everyone knew about me growing up with Anne's diary, and just in the community I was in, I thought everyone knew who she was. But as I grew up and as I started writing it, I learned that so many people don't know who she was. So to me, I needed to share her story with children, and having seen her speak to children, just that one brief meeting I got to have with her, I saw how important it was to her to share with children this message and this legacy. So I mean, it was the challenge was just being, for several years, from my writing to the production of the book, just steeped in this story that's so heartbreaking. I mean, I think for all of us who do this work, it's, just feeling the pain and fear of these people and trying to get it across. That's definitely challenging, but of course worth it. And it's so important, and gives a lot of perspective of what we have in times of peace.
Okay. Thank you. We are getting to the end of our program. I don't think we have time for more questions. There are some interesting questions yet, but we'll just have to read the book, and I'm sure we'll find out more about the red shoes and some logistical details like linen management and so forth. But thank you very much, Gillian and Meeg. So I will now pass this back to Sharon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. We are going to watch now a very interesting clip that probably none of you ever knew happened. This is a clip of the proceedings in Congress on February 23rd, 2010, discussing Resolution 1074, introduced by Mary Jo Kilroy, Congresswoman from Ohio, recognizing the heroism of Miep Gies and the role she played in protecting Anne Frank's family and saving the diary. The proceedings were about a month after Miep died at the age of 100. Miep received many awards, including being knighted by Queen Beatrix of the Netherlands, but perhaps her biggest honor she ever received was the Righteous Among the Nations Medal awarded by Yad Vashem. We will now watch a short clip of the proceedings in the United States Congress of Resolution 1074, recognizing the heroism of Miep Gies. But I must tell you that after I saw it on C-SPAN on February 23rd, 2010, I called Congresswoman Kilroy's office, and she got on the phone to congratulate her on the resolution and invite her to our annual gala in New York City. She told me that when she was a girl in a small, poor town in Ohio, after reading the diary, she was so inspired by the diary, she wanted to become a national leader. She said, quote, "I wanted to be what Anne was not allowed to be." And so please watch this wonderful, wonderful clip of the House proceedings.
Why is it important to honor Miep Gies? I recently visited Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem. It's an overwhelming experience. And as we pondered the horror of Hitler's plan to eradicate the Jewish people, we asked ourselves, how could this have happened? How could so many stand by silently? How could so many actually participate? And so it is important, I think, to understand that there are some who spoke up, heroes like Miep Gies, and to honor people like her, people who helped the Jews, who worked against the sea of hatred that had enveloped most of Europe at that time. People like Miep Gies, an ordinary woman who did an extraordinary thing. Like so many others who read Anne's diary, as a young woman, I was deeply moved by her steadfast optimism, even during a period of her life defined by the evil of that day. Thanks to Miep Gies' bravery, Anne's recollections have been preserved for future generations. Miep later described her efforts to assist the 8 people in hiding, saying, "It's nice to be appreciated, but I only did my duty to my fellow man. If I help people in need, anyone can do that, can't they?" The understated appraisal of heroic acts is one example of her modesty, of her integrity. We can learn much from Miep Gies, an ordinary woman showing extraordinary courage in the face of unspeakable peril during Nazi occupation and the Holocaust. She's a powerful symbol of resistance against oppression and injustice, an example of our human capacity to rise to even the most daunting of challenges. I urge my colleagues to join me in recognizing this incredible woman's life and legacy.
Fantastic. So right now, I'm going to give our panelists the opportunity to give you their final thoughts, starting with Meeg and then proceeding to Gillian. Meeg?
Well, that was so powerful to see at the end. I'm so glad we showed that. And I think that encapsulates it. I want to highly recommend Gillian's book as well. For a lot of the questions that you're asking, I think will be answered in her book. And for mine, I wanted to let you know, if you do buy one through Susa Mendes Foundation, I'll be signing them and including a little magnet, which has the cover of the diary around it. And it has Miep's quote: "We should not wait for our political leaders to make this world a better place. No, we should make this happen now in our homes and at our schools." And I think that's the message for me. And we heard her own words. We heard her own voice say that at the beginning. So I'll leave it at that.
Gillian, what would you like to say?
I'm going to end with Miep's words, actually. And in my book, The Legacy of Anne Frank, there is a whole chapter about Miep, as well as many, many inspirational people who've helped spread Anne's legacy around the world. On the night Miep Gies died, 11th of January 2010, by a strange coincidence, the Oscar-winning film Anne Frank Remembered was being re-screened on the BBC. After spending the evening preparing an obituary for a national newspaper about Miep, I settled down to watch the film and think about the woman whom I'd been lucky enough to know and had just been attempting to describe in words. As the 2-hour film closes, Miep stares directly into the camera and says in her broken English how important she finds it is to speak to children. Very interesting are the letters from the German children. They ask me everything, telling me that their father and grandfather didn't tell me anything about the war, saying that's the past and it is over. But that's not true. The past is always with you, your whole life, and we must learn from that past.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, Meeg. Thank you, Sharon Douglas and the Anne Frank
Thank you.
Center for Mutual Respect USA. Thank you to my dear friend and colleague, Mariana, and thank you to our large, wonderful audience. And we hope to see you all again next week. See you again. Be well. Have a nice
Thank
rest
you.
of your day, everybody.